Noah, I'm so happy to have you here. And this is your dog, Shemesh.
This is Shemesh, yeah.
Which means sunshine.
It does.
Noah is the contributor for the Washington Post and some other outlets. What are the other outlets that you contribute to?
So The Guardian, and then in the past the New York Times, Fortune magazine, and Israeli one called Haaretz,
Okay.
and a few others. But
Very cool. So I want to hear the story about the dog, because I was told that it's a good one.
So Shemesh here actually has a good personal story that reflects this Oliver Twist, but the sort of broad-based story about the breed. This is the Canaan dog. It's probably mixed with like a collie or something, but yeah, the Canaan dog probably has like the best origin story of any dog that I know of, pretty much. So basically, this dog they think was the one that's mentioned in the Bible, and if you see like the Egyptian hieroglyphics, you can see there's a dog that looks very similar to this one. He's got his pointy ears. You can't see it right now. He's got a bushy tail that kind of curls up, and these were the dogs of the ancient Israelites, the Jews, in the land of Israel. And they were used for herding and guarding, and they're just sort of like the all-around utility dog for those people at that time. And when they were exiled by the Romans just after the time of Jesus, the Romans didn't let people take their stuff with them when they exiled them, and that included dogs. And so these dogs became like ronin, like the Japanese samurai when they lost their masters. They just were made to roam the southern deserts of Israel and became semi-feral. Sometimes were co-opted and adopted by the Bedouins, a nomadic people that live still in southern Israel. And around the time of World War II, there was a woman, Rudolfina Menzel, and she was well known in Austria and Germany for training dogs for police, for the military, and then she and her husband had moved to Israel because of the Nazis and that situation. And so she saw these dogs in the South, and they were in the South, they were in the North, they were sort of these street dogs, and she was a Zionist, and beyond that though, she recognized the potential for them, and that they were these very highly intelligent dogs because they'd had to survive by themselves and by their wits and by their instincts for 2,000 years. And she trained them. And she trained them because they call them yishuv, the communities of these Jews that were there were vulnerable to attacks by the Arabs. And then they found that these dogs were really good at guarding the settlements and alerting them when those attacks were happening. And so that is what she did, and she named it. She actually gave them the name Canaan dog, and now they are the national dog breed of Israel.
That's very cool. I didn't know that there were national dog breeds.
I'm not sure I did either, but I feel like now there's like a national version of everything. National flower, national dog, national... I feel like it's like a marketing thing, It's like, so yes, these became the national dog of Israel.
And I assume now they're pretty popular in Israel, like you see them all over, or?
Yeah, that's the interesting thing, is it's a really interesting situation of like arbitrage, in a sense, because in Israel there's a kind of like, not to offend people who have chihuahuas, but like chihuahuas, you're sort of like all around and everything, and like cool and this and that, but like not... I wouldn't say unique, special, out of the ordinary, this and that, but then here, obviously, we don't really have... There's some breeders here that have Canaan dogs, but certainly not like Labradors or Chihuahuas or something like that. So in Israel, yeah, they're seen as sort of like street dogs, and treated poorly, by the way. And I do want to mention this, that like they even have documentaries over in the Middle East, because it's not just Israel that they're Jordan and I believe Egypt and Syria and even... further east, like I think Iraq and things like that. And the culture for dogs in that part of the world is not really great. It's not the same as we see them here. So they're subject to a lot of abuse, which is also probably plays into their like survival instinct and how they act. So, yeah. So
Shemesh came from Israel, right?
He did. Like I said, he's got this Oliver Twist story. So it's my girlfriend, Anushka. So it's... Really, it's her dog. I mean, they're sort of like one owner type dog. So he puts up with me. But so she, it's a great story. She posted, she like wanted a dog, and she went on the Facebook group, and she, some kid found him running around 3 months old in a part of Jerusalem, and she said, bring him by the house, we'll see. And she basically took him like not sight unseen, but she said she saw him. She's like, he's coming home with me. All right, no questions asked. And they checked to see if he had a chip, and if he was someone else's, no. So she got him, and yeah, he's a wild man, but he's a good boy.
Yeah.
Oh, and anyway, so the rest of that story is that she had him, and then She brought him. He flew over here. So he like, grew up on the streets of the rough streets of Jerusalem, and then he flew on an airplane to Los Angeles, and now he lives in Los Angeles. Which, sometimes the other people. He grew up in a rough neighborhood, so they're not always. You can give people not a fear, but like he's playing a different game than some of the other dogs in the area. But he's figuring it out. He's adapting to his new life.
So your girlfriend is from Israel as well.
Mm-hmm.
How frequently are you in Israel?
So, there was a period of time a couple years ago where it was like every 2 months, every 2-3 months. But now, it's the last time I think was back in like April. So I would say like semi-annually, basically at this point.
Okay. And you were in Israel before reporting on the war out there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so can you tell me a little bit about that and what the story was?
Sure. So I was based in Israel from 2012 to 2013, and there was actually 2 weeks after I got there, there was it's funny, a war and operation, and there's sort of like an ongoing state of conflict over there. So this was, I don't think they call it a war, it was like an operation.
Okay.
Right? And so this was the one at the end of 2012, and yeah, I had just bought a ticket and then decided to have this adventure and report and like convinced an editor to just kind of read my stuff and see what happens. And then 2 weeks later, there was like a war, and like rockets and sirens and this and that, and it was definitely like a shift. But the crazy thing over there is that like they'd have the sirens, right? And it's like woo, like a really like it gets you, and But for them, like I remember seeing it at a cafe. And they had the siren, and then the people at the cafe were complaining that, like, why isn't my order here? Like, I understand there's a siren, but, like, why isn't my food here? And so it's a different mentality.
Because it was commonplace? Or
yeah, I mean, the rockets I can't say were commonplace, but just, like, living in that sort of state of things where it's, like, an active, like, we are not going to let this disrupt our daily lives. And, they had, at that time, even Iron Dome, so they felt safe that the rockets weren't necessarily going to land in Tel Aviv, which they gave, I think in Tel Aviv you got like 8 minutes? Maybe not 8 minutes, like 2 minutes, which was like a ton of time versus like in the south in Ashkelon and Sderot, you got like 10 seconds. And I was down there also during that time, and down there they weren't so much just sitting at cafes and hanging out, they were like going into shelters. So.
Okay. All right, so you have to forgive my ignorance because I know very little about Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. Can you just sort of give me the broad brushstroke picture of what's going on there currently and how that's come to be through like years of religious?
Oof. All right. Sure. So currently, what's going on, and it's hard because it's definitely not a homogenous situation, depending on the different regions of Israel. If we're talking just specifically about the conflict, so you have the Gaza theater of action, and then you have the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, and then you have the northern border, Lebanon and Syria, and beyond, and so and Iran, which factors into all of them. So what I can say currently, what's getting the most attention, certainly in the last few days, is what's gone on the Gaza border. And so what happened in Gaza, I guess like the fastest way into understanding Gaza would be, it's hard because like there's no fastest way to understand everything over there. So there was an uptick in tensions, you can say, with rocket attacks from Gaza and then responses from the Israeli Air Force to there to stop those rocket attacks. But of course, even that's going to be controversial. Some people, it's like this cycle where it's like, no, it was the attacks of this, it was the attacks of that. But this was actually started, and again, it's like, where do you draw the entry and where do you draw the exit? But this current thing was started. There was an Israeli operation in Gaza, and they were, you never know the truth of it, but they were trying to like quietly get some information about someone or kill someone, and they ended up killing a Hamas commander who's there. And Hamas is in control of Gaza at this point, which dates back to 2006, 2007, when they had elections, and they took it over from the Palestinian Authority, which is the one that's in charge in Ramallah, that's supposed to be controlling the West Bank, which dates back to Oslo. So you can see it's like a constant thing there. But basically, Hamas, which is a terrorist organization recognized by every Western, and I think beyond Western country, as a terrorist organization, but they are the de facto sovereign controlling entity in Gaza. And the Israeli military went in quietly, and things, I think, went wrong, and they killed that commander and I think 5 or 6 other people, and then one of the Israeli soldiers got killed, and then they got out. And then this led to this like back and forth, and basically observers thought, everybody thought that it was going to turn into a full-blown war. I mean, the Israelis moved like tanks there and soldiers, and usually when they do that, it's like a buildup and I think they called reserves. And but they went right to the brink and then sort of dialed it back. And there's a lot of reasons for why that may have happened. And I think it's an interesting example because it shows that a lot of times the decisions, it's not this like religious conflict and that's the grounding impetus for everything that goes on there and everybody hates each other and this and that. I mean, people are acting from deep self-interest. And so, for instance, what happened in the wake of the Israeli government deciding not to go into Gaza, you had the defense minister, Avigdor Lieberman, resign. And he said, basically, this is a failure of the administration to take decisive action and people are going to die, they're going to get short-term benefits, but long-term it's going to be a problem. So he resigned, and then they thought there was going to have to be like snap elections because of that. And just today, then you had another politician over there who people also thought was going to resign and potentially replace Benjamin Netanyahu, who's the prime minister, and then his name is Naftali Bennett, and then he said today basically, no, I'm going to stay in the government, and we're going to try to figure this out anyway. So that's kind of from the Israeli side. And of course, there's lots of economic reasons and other security reasons for going in or not going in and this and that. So I know this is like an all over the place answer, and even things that are like supposedly or seem like simple this and that, it's not, and there's so many different factors. And
so a lot of people have confusion because it's confusing. There's like a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, I mean it is, and I think to kind of like take a step back though, if there's a way to sort of frame this issue, what you have is a sort of mutually, it seems, irreconcilable situation where, unlike other conflicts, or seemingly unlike other conflicts like Northern Ireland, where you have like sectarian violence, but then both sides maybe want to figure out a way to live in peace and figure this out. There are still parties on both sides of this that it seems don't, but at the same time, you have people who are benefiting directly from the current state of things, and you have, for instance, like on the Palestinian side, they call it normalization, and what normalization is normalizing Israeli Jewish presence in the land of Israel. And so if you're a Palestinian and you're seen talking to an Israeli, and that's like a capital offense, you can be killed for it because people say you're a spy. On the Israeli side, you have people who don't believe that the Palestinians, the Arabs, should be in Israel, but I'm not sure that there's a balance. Because, for instance, Israel offered, multiple times, 90-something% of the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria to them, and have offered multiple times they left Gaza. Gaza used to have Jews living there, and now they don't. And then people will say, well, it's still an open-air prison, and this and that, but that was in response to violence. And I think that to understand the Israeli point of view, it's still tied into this sense of, like, when you look at the map, it's Israel and then surrounded by 20-something Arab countries. 1 billion Arabs, and not all of whom are enemies necessarily. There are peace treaties with Egypt, with Jordan. You're seeing warming relations with a lot of the Gulf Arab countries. But you're talking about a people that the Holocaust happened, and there's all this rhetoric from Hamas saying we want to kill all the Jews and we want to fill us up. So there's fear from that side, and so it's just sort of the cycle that feeds into it. Like every time that there could be sort of like an opportunity to move things forward, there's just a lot of distrust on both sides, and a lot of people, like I said, a lot of people benefiting from the current state, and a lot of just like obstacles to overcome.
Do you think that pattern's just going to continue?
Yes.
Okay. So there's no real end in sight, you don't think?
You never know. We, my girlfriend and I, we heard this guy talk who's involved in the Northern Ireland peace process. And he said that basically, I think his quote was like, there wasn't peace until there was peace. It seemed dark. And then it happened all of a sudden that there was sort of some movement and some ways forward. I think that the biggest problem in Israel and the Palestinian territories is this division, is the separation. Because before Oslo, you had, exchanges, and people were going from Tel Aviv to Ramallah, and they were going from, interacting and seeing each other and this and that. And I remember I was in Ramallah, and I asked one of the guy who I was with and touring with, and I asked him, like, what is your impression of Israelis? Like, when you think of Israelis? And he said, a 19-year-old soldier who tells me I can or can't go here. And because that's the only interaction basically that they have. And then for Israelis, when you ask them a lot of times, what's your experience with an Arab or a Palestinian. It's a little bit different for Israelis because Arabs live in Israel, and 1.25, I think, million Arabs live in Israel, in Jerusalem, in the north, in Jaffa. But there's a distinction between them and the ones who live in these other areas, Gaza and the West Bank. And so it's like anything else. It becomes really easy to demonize the other when you're not interacting with that other. That said, there's this sort of like liberal universalist idea that like, oh, we all want the same thing, and we all just want to live in peace, and we all want good education for our kids, and I think it's a huge trap to fall into in this specific conflict because I don't think that's the case. And I think that the societies reflect that. And there are examples you can point to, and there are things you can look at, but basically to think that everybody wants what you want, it's pretty arrogant, and I think that it's not helped that advance that conflict at all. And so I'm not saying that one side wants death and destruction and one side wants peace and this and that, but the specifics in terms of what's driving the conflict on each side, I think is quite different.
Okay. And so is that some of your proudest work in journalism over in Israel, or?
I don't know, actually. It's a good question. That was a bit earlier in my career, and so I don't know. It's a good question. I think that certainly a lot of the work that I did there is I'm proud of, and I feel like was helpful in terms of like sort of showing the conflict, or not even showing the conflict, just like showing Israel in a more realistic and different light, and also in the Palestinian territories that like when you go over there, it's really easy to not see the conflict, especially in Israel. When you're on the beaches in Tel Aviv, you feel completely removed from it. Even like in the center of Ramallah and in these Palestinian cities, it's possible also to insulate yourself from it. Other ones, not as much. Jerusalem, it's all over. Jerusalem's just like a heavy city, because people are living and mixing, and it's all these ancient sites, and you feel it. You feel I feel like the holiness of it, but you feel the conflict, and everyone's sort of existing together somehow. And then you have Hebron, which is like the Wild West. So Hebron is a different situation. But to go back to the question, yeah, I would say that definitely some of the work there, it's definitely some of the most like, I don't know, interesting, exciting. You're trying to figure out these narratives, and that's the hardest part. Even that's why like some of these answers are rambling on a little bit, is because it's like, where do you draw the start point? Where do you draw the end point? And how do you construct, or what is the narrative that you're going to construct just based on these facts that, and when I do interviews over there, people would give you answers, and you'd have discussions that seem like parallel realities. Just like completely different, just realities, basically. So it was great.
Like different takes on the tensions altogether, or what do you mean?
Yeah, different takes on the tensions, different starting points. Like one side is talking about, I'm trying to think of like a specific example of this, but like, where, I'm drawing a blank right now, but like one example would just be like with the war. You can look at like the different conflicts, like what starts it and what led to it. And like I'm saying before, like it started with the Israelis killing this guy from Hamas, and then they responded to it. And then the people in Gaza would be saying, no, this is about like Israeli colonialist imperialism and this and that. And then the Israelis are like, what? Like, no, it's nothing to do with that. It's to do with because they tried to dig tunnels underneath the ground to come up and kill the people in the settlement, in the kibbutzes around Gaza. So, and then they want to talk about that, and they want to talk about this, and it's like supposed to be one story, and you really get good at figuring out like how to bring in both sides or not.
How much time did you spend in Israel when you were over there doing some of that work?
So that was 1 year.
Okay.
That was one full year over there, and then subsequently, like I said, probably half a dozen times, I think, since then, for various periods of time. Okay.
And you studied anthropology, right? Which I think is so cool. I think I would have been an anthropologist in another life. But do you find that anthropology and journalism kind of go hand in hand, or not so much?
I think that this is like one of the Steve Jobs things where it's like you connect the dots going backwards. Like I can't sit here and say like I did anthropology because I thought it would inform journalism. I never thought I'd be a journalist really. But looking back, you can definitely see the connections. I think the biggest one is like ultimately what I was just saying about taking disparate facts and constructing them into a narrative. So I'd say there's like two things. Number one is that, and number two would be just like jumping in to different realities and lives and ways of doing things, and observing and trying to.
These are skills that you picked up in anthropological studies that you, okay.
Yeah, definitely. Because I'd say like those are the two things that, I mean, there are different goals a lot of times between anthropology and journalism in terms of what you're trying to do or like what the finished product is, but definitely like the training, the interviewing techniques, the listening to people, the observation, like I'd say they definitely correlate.
So what's the difference in your opinion between anthropology and journalism?
Opinion in what?
Oh, just you had mentioned like the goals are different.
Oh.
How are they different?
So in journalism, I mean, you're trying to inform the public in a very sort of, not quick way, but like you're trying to do it in an active sense, like today. Like here's a story. How does it relate today? Why are we covering this right now? And why does it matter to the reader and the public? And it's something I go back and forth with editors a lot about, just because like here's a great story and I have this great narrative and this and that, and they're like, okay, but like, why do we have to do it now? Like, why can't we do it in a year or in 2 years or 5 years or never? And so there's that goal of journalism, and then in anthropology, the timelines I don't feel like are as specific. And so you have a lot more freedom and a lot more leeway in terms of like studying different cultures and different peoples, and you know the sort of like originating theories and the driving forces of anthropology I think are different too in terms of how you sort of perceive these cultures and how you like the role of the interviewer and the role of sort of like I feel like a lot of times in anthropology it's like you try to just pretend like you're the fly on the wall,
yeah,
you know, and just like almost like I don't want to say like a stenographer, but like it seems like it's more geared towards that as opposed to in journalism. I think it's a little bit more, a little bit more active maybe, and not like from an
What do you? So my knowing much less about both of these disciplines than you do. My take is okay. Anthropology, you're trying to assimilate into a culture and really become a part of it, and then kind of make sense of that and write ethnographies that somebody outside of that culture could read and sort of come to understand a little bit of that culture. Journalism, I don't know. I would think that responsible, good, thoughtful journalism would involve a bit of that, like trying to make people understand where the people they're reporting on are coming from. But journalism is really slanted a lot of times too, and that's definitely something you try to avoid in anthropology, I would think. Well, you become slanted from the culture studying's perspective, right?
Yeah. So I think in journalism, I think that there's different kinds. There's different sort of goals for the different types of journalism that there are, and even different stories. So you have like a feature journalism story, you have like a breaking news story, you have like a enterprise story where you're like or investigating something, or like a longer sort of like expose for that would be like more in a magazine piece. And I think that one of the things with journalism, especially now, is that I don't know that it's like a lot of things, you know, and there's a lot of disagreement about what it is and what it should be and what are the goals and what are we doing and ethics even, you know, even basic ethics. Like there's a surprising amount of disagreement between like what the like on the record everybody knows what it is, but like on background or off the record, there's divergence in understanding about what those terms mean. And those are supposed to be like basic sort of like journalism 101 type concepts.
So what do you mean? Like what's an example?
So like on the record everybody knows, right? Like if I'm like going and interviewing someone, I say, okay, this is on the record. I'm a journalist and this is on the record. So it means that everything that person says can be used and attributed to them in the article. But then you have like on background or off the record. And even with that, like there's like disagreements about what is contained in that, you know? So some off the record would be, you know, something that's like you can't attribute to that person, or you can attribute it to that person. I'm sorry, you can use the information, but you can't attribute it to that person, or you can like use a sort of a way of attribution, right? So you can say like a source deep inside the White House, or a high level ranking, this and that, and versus then like on background, you know, some people it's like, all right, so you can use the information, or you can basically use it as a tip, and then you have to find somebody else to actually say it, or someone that's going to like allow you to attribute it to them.
So it's like one level even of more sort of anonymity.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you talk to like a person in administration and say like, oh, you know, the office, you know, our office says that like we don't want to do A, B, and C. So then you can say like, so now you have that piece of information. Now you have to find somebody else to corroborate it, basically, versus like, you know, based on the level of attribution, sometimes they'd be like, okay, you can attribute this to like a high-ranking source. And again, there's like, you're finding that like there's wide ranges of disagreement, and you also have from people like who try to like do other, like you like having a conversation or an interview with somebody like a source, and they'd be like, oh, and this is off the record. But it's not really working like that. Like it's supposed to be a mutually agreed upon sort of interaction. And so if something's on the record, it's on the record. But of course, when you're in the moment, I mean, as a journalist, you're always sort of, you know, these are trust relationships. So there is, I mean, like, all right, is it worth it to put this piece of information maybe aside so that we can report on this, or vice versa, you know? And so it's hard. And what you're talking about, like stories being slanted and things of that nature, like that's a whole separate, it's a whole separate conversation that we can have, but it's sort of different from this, because this is like the nuts and bolts of journalism, and then the slanting and how that happens is sort of, it's a separate topic.
So I'm still having trouble understanding like practical examples of what the disagreements are with these nuts and bolts pieces. So if somebody says something is off the record or in the background, is that the term?
Background,
on background. What are the nuts and bolts? What's a practical example of what that looks like? What two journalists might interpret and do differently?
So I think that, again, like on the record, everybody knows what that means. Mm-hmm. We're talking about like off the record versus on background. So an example would be, you know, we're doing an interview here, and you'd be like, you know, you should check into this thing that City Hall is doing, or, I mean, it's hard. Like,
or it just mean that, like, I feel like I am kind of understanding the difference between off the record and on background, but I'm not understanding, you were saying that journalists have like totally different interpretations of these, or in practice act totally differently when somebody says this is off the record from one another, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, sometimes, and sources have different understandings of what it is too, which is where you get a lot of this disagreement. Like the sources say like, I thought this is, you know, you're not going to be able to like identify this back to me, versus like, I thought I didn't know that, and this and that. And so what I always do is I don't really use these terms, you know, or when someone says like, this is off the record. So I wouldn't just say like, okay, I'd be like, what do you think that means? Like, what are we, you know, doing here? Because again, as a journalist, like, there's maybe the highest level of responsibility, like, of accountability is to the public, you know, but like, I don't know, like, I put that right up with like protecting sources in these situations, because it's sort of like, it's the whole ball game. Like, if you like burn a source, or if sources can't trust you, or if the readers can't trust you, like, that's it. Like, then there is no journalism, and that's what you're seeing now. But to go back to the question, would be like, someone would say, you know, like, okay, like talking to somebody in the governor's office, right? And the person in the governor's office says, like, we're thinking to do A, B, and C policy, but you can't use my name because I'm not like authorized to say this, and like we don't necessarily want this to be, you know, like set in stone right now. And there's a lot of reasons why someone would tell you something, like leak it and get it out there, like as a trial balloon, like to see what the reaction is. And so then in that case, and then if it did come back to them, like they would get fired, and they'd have a lot of repercussions and consequences. So you could either like, and if they feel like saying like a high-ranking official would be enough, you know, to anonymize them, then you can do that. Versus like if they think that, for instance, like this piece of information with any sort of level of attribution can be traced back to them, then they don't want to have themselves associated with it in any way, and then you have to find somebody else to corroborate it. And so, again, there's just like disagreements about, or different understandings about like on background, off the record, which is why, again, at this point, like I don't use terms like that. You just say like, all right, you know, what do you think that means, and like, can we use, you know, and then and that's all something that's very important and taken very seriously by every serious journalists. But again, like you read stories sometimes where it's like, especially like the higher level public officials, where they're like, you know, and the Clinton campaign was doing this. I read about it, where they were just like sending emails like, this is off the record, and then say a bunch of stuff. But like, it's not usually, it's like not how it works. You know, it's not like dictated by one party to another. Or if it is, you know, then there's a choice, right? Like someone would say, you know, I'll tell you this, but it's off the record. You know, are you willing to, you know, sort of not have this lead back to me, or this is on background? And and then there's a choice, like I want to hear this or I don't want to hear this. But it's not just like, all right, this is off the record, and then say a bunch of stuff.
Okay.
Then it's not as well defined as what to do with that.
Are there any, I'm assuming there aren't really any legal protections for just a general member of the public who gives a tip to a journalist and they wanted that tip to be off the record, whatever that means, and the journalist doesn't really follow that. I'm assuming the journalist technically is not going to face any legal problems, right?
Not in this country. I mean, there could be, I suppose, like civil penalties if that source has like a repercussion for it, I suppose, but I've never heard of that. And but basically it'd be like, that would kind of like end a journalist's career. Like there's sort of like two things I think that would end a journalist's career. One would be making things up, that would do it. And then like burning sources because that would come out, and then who would ever trust that journalist ever again for anything? And the publications also don't want to be associated with that because, again, with journalists, I think there's misunderstandings. And again, when you say journalists, like there's a wide swath of journalists here. But so I'm talking about like professional, serious, like not partisan hacks and pundits, but like serious journalists at any level. Take this stuff super seriously. I mean, because that's what we're doing. And if we're not, we don't get paid that much. So it's like you talk about like core values of what it is. It's like, finding the story, protecting sources. I mean, you saw journalists go to jail over it during, Jim Risen, I think, was during the Obama administration. I don't know if he ended up going to jail, but his source did. But he was willing to. He was not willing to give up that source, and he was willing to take that to the ends of the river to like, to show how, how these things get taken, because people, depending on the story, like it's not too much to say, and I don't usually deal with that. I don't know that I've ever dealt with it, but like where if someone got revealed, like they would be killed, but around the world and in even here, like it happens. And so, I mean, you can just imagine from a human perspective, like, would you, what story is worth the person who trusted you to tell you something to then get killed? So
it all makes me think of the Snowden, all the Snowden stuff that came out in those documentaries, and Laura Poitras, is that how you say her name?
I think so.
Interesting stuff. That's just an aspect of journalism I've never thought about or considered before, all the risks that you take in protecting your own sources.
You do. I mean, again, I don't want to like overstate my case. I'm not doing like national intrigue type stories like that, but plenty of my colleagues are, and it's taken with the utmost seriousness. And I think that there's a lot of like public misunderstanding also about like sourcing, about this issue that you're talking about. And so when people say like anonymous sources, some people think some readers think that like they're anonymous to us as journalists. They're not. We know exactly who they are, and we verify who they are, because again, like there's like misdemeanors and felonies in journalism, I think is the saying, and like the misdemeanor is like a typo or correction or something like that, but like the felony is like being naive and like getting taken for a ride and having somebody like spin you a story, and then it turns out that it's not true, or like that you've been sort of co-opted or used for somebody else's purposes that, and then those things are not true. So, it's like all these things we have, like, if your mother tells you she loves you, like check into it.
Yeah, so how do you check into that thoroughly? I mean, if you hear a tip that sounds potentially fishy, how do you follow up on it? And what does it take before you're convinced that this is real enough, I'm going to put my name to it and publish it?
I can tell you that the threshold's really high for that. I mean, it's not like one corroboration, like it's several when you're talking about stories like that. So it depends, again, on the specifics of what it is. I can tell you...
Which story? Are you thinking of like the Snowden thing still, or just stories in general?
So Snowden, like they actually went to see him.
Right.
And they actually like went to Hong Kong, I think is the way that story goes. And then he like
showed them the documents.
Stuff. And then I don't know how they specifically, I think it says how they like followed up and tried to corroborate from third sources and this and that. But like in a very basic way, without talking about like Snowden, national security.
Yeah. Let's say like the surfing. I want to ask you a little bit about the surfing stories, but well, actually, maybe could you just tell me a little bit about the surfing stories, and then maybe let's use those as an example, because that sounds like it has some elements of...
Not really. So they're a little bit separate.
Maybe there's a different example then.
And it goes back to like the different kinds of stories and things like that, but like there are definitely similarities, but like one example I think that elucidates what you were talking about is my friend who won a Pulitzer, Rob Kuznia. So he got a tip. The way he tells the story, I don't necessarily want to tell other people's stories, but just it's a really good example of it. That like he got a tip about this superintendent. Someone just sent like, you should check into this. Like the superintendent's doing things, shady. And so then you'd like go and try to just unspool the thread a little bit. Like you just talk to people. Like a lot of journalism is literally just talking to people. Like picking up the phone, going out, knocking on doors, whatever it is, and following up on those leads and saying, hey. And not lying obviously, but like trying to get people to talk and figure out how much veracity there is to any sort of like specific claim. So
do you find just sources that don't know each other but should all know what's going on? Like, let's say the superintendent, you find different faculty members that interact with that superintendent but don't necessarily interact with each other. Otherwise, how do you really?
I mean, look, there could be a conspiracy. Like there could be people who like conspire as a group to like get a fake story out there. It could happen. It usually doesn't.
Okay.
But you would want three. I mean, the standard is like usually like three independent sources to like all confirm the same thing. But then even a lot of times with like a story like, all right, there's like corruption in the school district and this guy's like appropriating funds and he's getting this super inflated salary. There would need to be some like physical documentation, like official documentation that shows this somehow. Like it's not enough like three teachers say, yeah, he's totally doing it. That wouldn't really meet the standard. I mean, at the newspaper, my editors wouldn't publish that. Because you publish that and then it's not true and then you have a problem. Again, that goes back to like being taken for a ride, or it's like half as much as what people said it was, and then there's corrections. And there are examples where like big publications have done things like that, and then it's a big problem, and it like demeans the whole industry because people then look at those small, like sometimes big, sometimes small examples. The New York Times dealt with this with Jason Blair. The guy was just making up sources and making up stories, and then you go back and people are like, I don't believe the New York Times, and then they point to this, and the New York Times could have 10,000 stories, and like he did a dozen or 100, whatever it was. And they can issue all these corrections and say, look, here's how it happened, here's how we're fixing it, here's how we're changing it. But the damage to an extent is done.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of it, like it's hard to say like a flow chart of how you would pursue a tip from a story, but generally it's like someone gives you a tip and then you just try to verify that information or learn as much as you can. There's standard ways of doing it, like talk to like people that are retired, talk about people that may be more willing, maybe who are not working there currently, but they know. Going to court records, going to other public documents, and then sort of trying to triangulate that and piece it together.
So this is changing gears a bit, but I think it would be interesting to ask you a little bit about fake news, because I'm wondering, I feel like I don't have a full understanding of what people are afraid of when they talk about fake news. I don't know if they're afraid of journalists just making up a story for that journalist agenda, or if they're more concerned about like twisting or stretching of truth. So not like a complete fabrication, but instead this is so slanted that it's just sort of cherry picking these facts that doesn't give an accurate picture, and that's the fake news fear. What is your sense for that?
I really think it depends on who you ask.
Okay.
Again, it's the same thing with, we're using these terms, not you and I, but just in society, like we're using these terms, fake news.
Yeah.
On background, off the record, and
what does it mean?
I'm really not sure that people have the same definitions or they're operating from the same like starting point for what they're talking about. Like when Donald Trump talks about fake news, I even don't know what he's talking. Like he's talking about stories, like you're saying, like are they whole, like fabricated out of whole cloth? Are they, like you're saying, slanted, this and that?
Or are they even just like those like fake Twitter messages that people repost and it goes viral on like Facebook or something?
Yeah, so I feel like there's like two flavors of, like you said, like there's like the just made up stories from like whoever, the Russians or whoever it is, or these like mills that are just pumping out these stories to get clicks and things like that. And then again, there's like the separate issue of like biases and angles and slants and things like that. So when we're talking about fake news, it's not, that's not a journalism problem. That's not a journalism industry problem. That's a Facebook problem. That's a Twitter problem. That's a humanity, society, whatever you want to call it, like partisanship problem. Like journalism doesn't really connect with that. It's just being used, it's co-opting journalism or like the look of journalism to further their cause. I don't know if there's a role in journalism to necessarily...
Well, hang on. I have to think about that. I have to think about what you just said, because I don't know if I'm not a journalist, but I don't know if I would agree with that, because if we are talking about the fake news flavor of like, this is a wholly fabricated story, clearly that's a journalism problem. But that sounds like it's very rare, right?
That is rare. That doesn't, I mean, I wouldn't say that doesn't happen, but I would say that like I don't know any colleagues that I have or stories I've heard of where just you have a journalist just making up a story.
Right, that seems like it would be, yeah. I mean, I'm in academics, right?
Yeah.
That'd be somebody doing those fake papers like about vaccines giving autism and things like that. That it comes out eventually, usually, and then it's devastating, but also very rare.
Yeah. So I think that, and that's what I'm saying, that like, that's not a problem. When I'm saying like that's not a journalism problem, is not a problem currently in American journalism that reporters are just inventing stories, or even I would say like sometimes you can get into the subtleties of this, of like stories that certain publications choose to run and how solid they are with those stories, and but like this like there's like these bizarre conspiracy theories that come out about that came out in like 2016 election about Hillary Clinton and child trafficking at a pizza shop or something, and like I don't know, there was like something about that, and some guy then went to that pizza shop and I think started shooting people, and that didn't touch with journalism. Like that wasn't a New York Times story, it wasn't a Washington Post story, it wasn't a local story. That was just like a conspiracy theory that got like promulgated on the internet and then clicked on and this and that. But like I don't like there are problems in journalism today, a lot of them, from a business standpoint, from a content standpoint, you could say, from a sourcing, from a trust standpoint, all of those things. But again, and we should talk about
well,
this.
but I mean, is a trust issue with journalism not the problem of fake news? Maybe I'm thinking about this incorrectly again.
Yeah.
I'm not like an experienced person in these areas, but just as myself not deeply thinking into these issues, my gut reaction is that like the reason trust with journalists is low is related to this issue of fake news, and probably less like I'm not really worried that some CNN or Fox News anchor is completely fabricating something, but I am a little bit concerned that they're taking things out of context or cherry picking, like I was saying earlier, to make it sound like what's being said is very different than if you read full context on both sides, on both liberal and conservative. And that seems like if that's what people mean by fake news, that does seem like a journalism problem.
That is a journalism problem.
Okay.
So I wanted to make that distinction, or at least like go back to the distinction that you made, which I agree with, that you have the sort of like made up out of whole cloth Hillary Clinton conspiracy theories, that thing, and like the Russian hackers and this, and like just literally stories that are not based in fact at all, and then putting them out there and people click on them and make them viral. And that's not something that's going on in journalism, to make up stories out of whole cloth. And people, it'd be so easy, you would think, to like push back against it, although it turns out it's not, because if it was, then like these things would happen. But that's not going on. We're not making up stories. What you're talking about, though, in terms of selective narratives, in terms of how to position these stories, that absolutely is going on.
Okay.
It's absolutely going on, and it's absolutely a journalism problem, and it's something that has not been resolved, and it continues today not to be resolved, because a lot of the norms and a lot of the standards and a lot of the things that journalism's sort of been based on, in a sense, or at least taken as not like as sort of like starting points, are no longer exist. So you have a president who does not have the same relationship with the truth as other presidents, even though like public trust in the government has sank since like the Vietnam War. But it becomes a question of not just like Trump and his like truthfulness and this and that, but just like how he approaches the media and the norms that he chooses to ignore, and that are not illegal, and it's not, there's a book I read, it was a CIA officer who was like, look, it's not illegal to lie to the press. And he's right. It's not illegal to lie to the press. It's the press's job to find out who's lying and to then try to bring these facts together to the public to decide. But it's a lot harder to do that in practice than it is in theory. So like what you're talking about, selective facts or narratives or stories. And it's very simple to figure out, like when there's these shootings, you can see it just in the public discussion, right? Like there's a shooting somewhere. One side wants to talk about gun control. One side wants to talk about, weirdly enough, gun control, but in a different way, the opposite way. And then they want to talk about mental health, and they want to talk about public safety, and then they want to talk about this. So, again, like the story that you want to write. So you could say 12 people were killed in Thousand Oaks, and then that's like the AP way kind of doing, like the wires, like it's just this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. But people want more than that a lot of times. And by the way, AP does also context, but like sort of, you have like the bare bones, what happened, especially like in the wake of these events. And then you have sort of the analysis, or the context. I won't even call it analysis, context. And when you start getting into context, that's when you start getting into this murkiness. And when people are saying like the New York Times or whoever is like looking at it from a certain perspective, I would argue that they're correct. you know?
Okay, so you're saying that people want, I mean, like journalism, if you just gave pure facts, tends to kind of fall flat because people who are consuming these articles or videos, whatever they are, want a slant more or less.
I think that they do want a slant. That's my personal opinion. But more than they want a slant, I would say that they want to understand or need to understand the context. I mean, if you say, for instance, in a story like, I don't know, like, what's a recent example of this? Like, okay, that the esports industry, I've done a lot of stories on like esports, professional video games. Like the esports industry is worth $1 billion. Okay, that seems like a lot, but how much is that in relation to the NFL, right? How much is that in relation to the movie industry? How much is that? So it's like you can put numbers out there, you can put facts out there, but like how do we understand what those facts and figures mean, or growth rates and like percentages? Like when you just throw things out there without sort of understanding how those exist in a way, I think that the story is not as valuable to the reader. And so at every point there has to be decisions and discussions about what are we going to include, what are we not going to include. Israel's a great example of this. This was the best, probably the best, easiest to understand example of this when you're talking about these things, because like even something that's like the last war that they had there in Gaza, they'd say like, okay, 60 or whatever, 60 something Israelis have been killed and 2,000 Palestinians have been killed. And a lot of times they just put that at the end of the article. And those are accurate. I mean, there was some debate about it, but like those are facts. But when you look at those facts, you think like, well, if it's 64 to 2,000, you know, like a football game, one side is really killing the other side a lot more. But then, and a lot of news organizations chose to just report that. But, you know, what about the fact that like Hamas is putting their rocket launchers next to their schools, inside apartment buildings, inside, and this is also going on now in other parts of the Arab world, and you're starting to see it more in Syria, in that war, and in Iraq, and they're seeing of like civilian shields and human casualties as a result of that. And so then it's like, people, I think if they understood that, then there's a fuller picture that's sort of being created. But again, if you have 800 words to get into all this, you know, as we said in the beginning of this interview, like I'm trying to figure out a way to create the coherent narrative from the last few weeks versus the last few months versus the last few thousand years, and it's not easy. And everyone, especially in these highly contentious issues, is going to feel like part of what they want to hear about, or part of like the thrust that they want to hear is being left out.
So is the press writing slant because people want slant, or do people want slant because the press is writing slant? That's
a hard question. First of all, I don't know that I would call it slant. I mean,
not always.
Yeah, I don't think that the press is writing slant. I mean, certainly cable news is slanted, right? And we all know that. Like Fox versus MSNBC, Fox News versus MSNBC, and now CNN. So I don't think I can accurately say that like the media, the journalism, especially like written print media, is like writing slant. And I think that's also really important at this point to note the distinction between like the op-ed pages and the reporting pages. And I think sometimes people get those sort of conflated as well, that like the op-ed pages for newspapers are separate, or they're supposed to be separate from the reporting. And so like you could have, for instance, like the New York Times or the Washington Post, like the op-ed pages will be, and the editorial boards are slanted left, but it doesn't necessarily mean then the reporting gets slanted left. Like there are different sort of like organizational charts. De facto, though, I mean, it takes a special kind of person to sit here at this stage of the game and be like, no, they're both down the line, unbiased, like whatever. No, I mean, and there's a part of me that thinks like that at some point we should just do it like the British do it, and just be like, you know, put it out there and just be like, yeah, we're a center-left news media organization. That's where we're writing from, and give the audience some credit that they understand that. And I think that it would help, because then people would be like, oh, then the slant wouldn't be the issue, and we wouldn't be debating about, you know, this is bias, and that. We'd be debating like the merits of the situation, of the article, instead of like, you know what I mean, like the content or the situation of what it's talking about, instead of like, this is biased.
Are journalists trained to, well, I guess your degree is in anthropology, but are journalists generally trained to try to write without a bias? Or,
yeah, definitely.
I mean,
Definitely.
I'm asking because it's not obvious to me anymore.
I know what you mean. I know what you mean. It's funny because my reaction is that because like it's funny because yes, you're absolutely trained to do that, but in practice, like it's not that it's hard. It's just like I think it's impossible. I think it's impossible to write an article that's objective. I don't even know what that means.
Right. I think the best thing is just to own up to, okay, this is kind of our biased perspective. We are center right or whatever.
Yeah, and so, but actually, you ask a good question, and the reality is that yes, there are things that you do and techniques and like getting sources from all sides of an article to contribute, and even like, and that's the interesting thing is that like in a reading of the same story, if you read it from like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, your local newspaper, the same story and how they cover it. And if you were to like remove the title of the publication, I don't know that every single time you could say, like, okay, this is the liberal New York Times and this is the conservative Wall Street Journal. And I'm not sure that it's that consistent, but it ultimately becomes, it just becomes difficult. Like when you're talking about, all right, all of these different facts and all these different narratives and all these different voices, and like, again, like which ones do you include and how much and how do you construct this narrative? And sometimes it may come out to seem this way or come out to seem that way, but like I think that a lot of times, and this is a discussion that does take place in journalism, is like it's the perspective and where that journalist is coming from. And so you talk about issues of like diversity, but not just like ethnic diversity, but like experiential diversity. And I think that it becomes extremely helpful because you can see things or focus in on things or identify things that like person A can see the person B wouldn't necessarily be able to see or be sensitive to. And so, yeah, and then when you're talking about like, are you trained? Like, I didn't go to journalism school. I mean, it's a lot of journalists feel, myself included, that it is more of like a trade. Like, it's better to just go out and
do it.
Go do it and like get some experience and learn and make your mistakes, hopefully quietly, and move on. But you know, and editors also have a big role in all of this too. And we're talking a lot about journalists, but like at the end of the day, even like freedom of the press. Like, yeah, freedom of the press to the extent that like your editor allows it, because you know, and the publisher allows it.
Yeah.
And so, and that's the other thing is that again, for like most articles, it's not just like the journalist writes it and posts it online. Like, there's a review process. There are multiple people looking at it.
What is sort of the general process for getting any piece published?
After you mean like after a certain, like what's the review process, or just like in general?
Just like kind of a. I guess I'm thinking even broader than that. Like, how do you become a journalist? How do you get on retainers? How do you then get a specific story to be published?
Very good questions. I would say there's different pathways to do it. And I think the quickest way to sort of break it down would be like, the one way would be like, go get a journalism degree, ideally like a master's in journalism, right? And spend $50, or however much it costs, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, just like a year's salary for most journalists. And then get an internship and go from there. Like that would be the one way to do it. Another way would be like, this is like the more traditional way, would be like, go work for like a small local newspaper and then write a bunch of stories, get recognition, sort of work your way up the ranks to bigger and bigger ones. And then there's the way that I did it, which is like you just go to a international place of news value and just, like I said, convince an editor to read your stuff and just go and just start basically reporting and read as much as you can, and there's a lot of resources online, and talk to as many people as you can, and it sounds funny to say it like this, just go out and report, and anybody can be a reporter, but the reality is that anybody can. I mean, it's like any other job or profession. Like you go, you get your experience, you learn, and you know, it turns out that like the basics of it are pretty, you know, it's like chess, right? It's like easy to learn the rules, except for on the record, off the record, on background, there's a disagreement, but you know, the basics, like, you know, go interview people and get the interviews and put it in, you know, the inverted triangle of journalism, like the most important stuff, and then who, what, when, where, how, you know, who, what, when, where, how, and then go and do it. And then, of course, you know, it gets more and more complicated as you go on, and what quotes to use and what questions to ask and how to make an article, not just that has the facts, but like that people want to read and that's interesting, gives the context, like that takes years. But the basics of like going out and like reporting on a city council meeting, and even actually that's not as simple as it seems, but just like, you know, a local fair. You know, I think most people instinctively like would know how to do that. You go and interview a few people, talk to the person who organized it, how many people, how big is, or maybe it's not obvious. Like you go, you know, you just like the basic facts to share with people, and then it builds from there, I guess. So.
Okay. And then, so you get, if somebody starts to read your stories and they like them, that's when you may or may not be able to be on a retainer with them? And how do the retainers work? How long are those?
So those are, different. I would say that that's not the usual way of doing things. Like the usual way would be like just freelancing. So you go out and like go to a place of news value and start like figuring out pitches and stories, and then finding editors like by any which way you can, networking and or cold emails. That's worked for me a few times. Like with like a pitch email basically, and be like, here's the story, here's the angle that I want to do it on, and then here's the people I can interview, and my rate or whatever it is. And then an editor would look at it and say like yes or no basically, and then that's sort of how you get your foothold into it. And then ideally you just build on it and you generate trust. And when I'm talking about also like it being a trust business, like it works with the public like that, but it works with editors like that too. Like you could have the same pitch from two people, one person that this editor knows and the other one that they don't. They're just going to choose the one from the person they know, even if the angle is slightly weaker or not as interesting, just because editors don't want to get burned either. Yeah. So it's also like it's like we were talking about like Silicon Valley, like with VCs, like they're not just going to write a check for $500,000 like some person who walks in and there's no way of contextualizing who that person is. Like, here's $500,000, sounds like a good idea. No, they want to know, all right, how did, the introduction, how did we meet? Have I seen your other work? How do I know, and this and that. So, like I said a few minutes ago, like just go out and report things and see how it goes. It's simplifying it to a really big extent. And of course, the more sensitive the story, the more like complex the story, the more of experience a lot of times editors want to see. So it's like, if you don't have any credits, you don't have any stories, like you just got to figure out how to get it any which way to get something published, and then you can build off of that.
Okay. And you had mentioned earlier just talking about lots of different types of journalism. So I've been honing in on just kind of traditional article writing and reporting, and I guess also like news anchors, video. But what are some of the emerging types of journalism that you're seeing? So there's the small, Twitter captions that could be fake news that go viral on Facebook. So I imagine that's like a micro form of journalism that we could talk about, whether it's real or not. But what else is there?
So like, again, I wouldn't call it that journalism. Like it purports to be journalism, and it uses like the trappings of journalism, but it's not journalism. It's content marketing to an extent. And there's an interesting explanation I read about like what happened into the 2016 election, that actually the impetus for doing that from the Rush, and nobody knows, but like it's one made sense to me. It was more financial than anything else. Like people saw that people were clicking on these slanted sort of like posts or captions, whatever it was, and like when you get people clicking on things, there's a way to make a lot of money off of that. Just with even like the arbitrage on like how much you have to pay Facebook to serve that ad versus like if you get these people to click to another website, how much you can charge people to then advertise on your outbound website. And then you see that there's like a distinction in those rates, or like not a distinction, but like a difference, and then you can make a ton of money off of it.
So the idea being that some of this stuff happened just from like clickbait.
Yeah.
The problem with clickbait.
Clickbait, yeah. And I don't know, I would, so here's a great example. Like that theory that I've just said, if I told my editor and I was like, hey, let's do a story on that, they'd be like, no. Like you can't just tell, like it seems like a great theory, but like, how do you verify that? How can you show that that's what happened? Well, I'd have to find somebody, like I'd interview the person maybe who did it, and then I'd try to, even if whatever they told me, I tried to like verify those figures somehow. Like, do you have a bank statement? Do you have, sort of email, anything like that? And then that would maybe then eventually reach the threshold of doing it. And so again, I don't know if that was the impetus, and but again, I don't see that as journalism. I see it as content marketing, but. It becomes a problem for journalists and journalism because it's in now that sandbox. So, there is probably, again, a responsibility from journalists like
figure out how to differentiate.
Right, how to differentiate. But again,
hard.
But I put that on Facebook now because Facebook wants to say like, all right, we want to host all of your news stories or Apple News or whoever, and they want to take that responsibility, and all of the content marketing, clickbait, fake news is being hosted on their platforms. I feel like it's on them to do it now because they've taken that mantle of responsibility, which Facebook has started to do. And now you see like Washington Post, like there's a little I think for like information, and it's like the Washington Post is a da-da-da. This CGTN is a Chinese state-run organization. So they're trying to do that a little bit. I think it's helpful. But in terms of the question about like the different kinds of journalism and what's going on, so I think that there's different ways to answer that. I think that there's like the outlet or the medium, right? So you can talk about like Snapchat. You can talk about, for instance, I interviewed the new owner of the Los Angeles Times who's talking about using esports and video games as like a platform to get news out or to reach younger people where they are, and like using that as an outlet and a medium. So I think that like there's no shortage of examples of different ways to get news to people or to.
So what would that look like? The gaming example or like the esports example? Is it like they're playing a game and there's like a news feed along the side, or how does it?
I asked them, I didn't really get an answer out of it, but I think that like there's a few different ways and possibilities about it. I think that one, it's like looking at Twitch or looking at Discord and like those communication platforms, in integrating news, like having a channel on Twitch. The Washington Post has done this. They've started to do this. Like there's a Washington Post channel or feed on Twitch, and it's like right there next to all the other ones. Like that could be one way to do it. I know that there's examples of publishers, of video game publishers that have like put like within games like little banners of like vote. You know, it's a very like rudimentary or beginning way to do this, like vote, or you know, click on this to get more information about how to do it. So you can talk about like in-game promotions as well, and things like that. But so from the medium standpoint or from like the outlet standpoint, there's stuff like that, VR, AR, all the other like buzzwords about just new mediums and technologies and things like that. And then as far as like the new ways of doing journalism, I think that actually there's been like a sort of like a settling to an extent, or like an intermediate settling. Like before, like in like say 5-10 years ago, it was like all about like independent reporters and like CNN and like reporters. Like I'm just gonna go out with my cell phone and like record some stuff, and then you know that's gonna replace these news outlets, right? Like blogs, right? And I feel like that's sort of, we've seen sort of like the tapering off of that to an extent, or at least that those blogs have been co-opted by mainstream organizations, or they've in some cases like become sort of on the level with those, and they've become more professionalized. Like in Hollywood, you'd have like Deadline Hollywood, Hollywood Reporter, Variety. They've been sort of like conflated in a way. Yeah,
it's interesting that the trend for a lot of these sort of decentralized businesses is for it to kind of become more and more formalized. Like I remember when Uber could just be some beat up junky car and that was it. And now it's like there's water bottles and you can select your own radio station, and it starts to defeat the original purpose, I think.
Yeah. I think it's interesting though about Uber. I think I read, or Travis was saying that I think it started in San Francisco, right? But then it became something about like, did it start though as like a premium service? Do you know?
I don't know.
Like black cars, like the replacement for black cars, and then it went down to like, and then they found out that like there was this market for just like everyday rides.
Yeah, Uber, I think it did start as like a limousine.
I think it may have started,
and then it drops down. So you're probably right about that.
But to your point, in terms of like the professionalization of it, I think that connects with journalism to the extent that like, people want to be taken seriously.
Yeah.
And I think that.
Well, and now it's important, or you're going to be, you know, you don't want to be labeled fake news if you're the single person going out with your.
Yeah, and so I think that the trend towards that, or like in the Uber example or in the services example, reflects journalism. Yeah, to the extent that like it just makes it seem more legit. I tend to think that people do it in Ubers and Lyfts for like higher tips. You know, it's like a more pleasant experience. But the instinct, I think, is the root of it's the same thing, in terms of like, yeah, just being taken more seriously. And the same thing happened with like, Deadline Hollywood, and in that Hollywood example, Politico. And I don't remember, but I don't know that they started as like a blog, but certainly it's an upstart online-based news organization. And so because now everything is online, there is that flattening out to the extent that like ABC News for TV is competing with the New York Times, is competing with Politico, and so it's like they're all in the same platform, and they all sort of, some have more video than other ones, but it's, there's been that sort of like flattening out, at least online. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I think, I don't know if there's more, and I think like going forward, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say. I think that like the biggest thing is that Trump has been great for news. Really, he's like a financial boom for news, and Jeff Zucker talks about this at CNN. Everyone's ratings have gone up. I think. I mean, the subscriptions for the New York Times have gone up, for the Washington Post, views, and certainly like there's been segmentation more. It's like half the country won't read the New York Times. I think like trust. There's a recent poll that looked at this. I don't know if it was by like the Reuters Oxford thing or by Pew, but like it looked at like trust factors for different news organizations, and you find that like there is that extreme polarization. Like half the country doesn't trust the New York Times, half the country doesn't trust Fox News,
Right.
and so.
What's sort of your take on that? Like, just given what you were saying a little bit ago about how fake news, the slant can be a problem, but people aren't really fabricating stories. Like, what level of trust should people be having in New York Times and Fox News and CNN?
I think we were talking about the reporting. We're talking about like the Fox News actual news segments. Not that, I mean, Bill O'Reilly's not on there anymore, but like that stuff, that's like entertainment. And that's been entertainment for a long time, to like work people up and, and this could be a good segue to the intellectual dark web, but like, it's entertainment, driving ratings, and Rachel Maddow is the same thing. And so that I think people should take with a huge grain of salt, because those are just advocacy entertainment outlets, and that's it, or programs. But when we talk about like Fox News reports from different areas, when we talk about New York Times reports from different areas, those, I mean, I think are extremely high level of confidence. I mean, everything, it's human nature. It's impossible to know that like everything is going to be factual. But what I can say is this, is that there's a strong intention to get the story right, and to accurately reflect what's going on. I mean, yeah, the reporters have agendas, but again, it's like, are there these like conspiracies to get things, like move things forward in these news organizations? No. But are there people with experiences who see those experiences reflected, or want to see those experiences reflected in the content? Yes. So I'd say it's a lot less nefarious and a more just like everyday life.
Yeah.
It's just sort of like people are people.
So let's get your take on the intellectual dark web. So are you suggesting that the intellectual dark web kind of emerged in response to like Megyn Kelly shows and things like that, or am I reading too much between the lines there?
No, I think I don't know about Megyn Kelly in particular, but that sort of genre of thing, not her on NBC, like her on Fox News.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody watched her on NBC, but or if they did, they didn't like it. But I don't know if that's the right response to it. I don't know that it reacted in response to that. I think it's more of a reaction in response to the other side of things, that like there's this whole intellectual through fair of ideas that they didn't feel that there was a space for. And so that's why, for instance, like with podcasts, they just skirted the traditional pathways of trying to get these ideas in front of people, because there's direct ways to do it now, which is something that Trump has realized through Twitter, that like he doesn't need the media, this medium anymore, and he can just get these ideas directly in front of people. Not to compare at all, and I want to be super clear about this, I'm not comparing him to ISIS at all, but they both recognize the same thing, because it used to be with journalists that you needed them, and like even when you go to these places, like journalists would be safe because you needed the journalists to get your idea in front of people. Jeffrey Goldberg talks about this when he was in the Balkans, and I don't remember if he felt threatened about this, or if that was like the last time that journalists could be like fully safe in a conflict zone. But like it was like that you needed to convince the journalist to get your story out. So you wouldn't kill the journalist, you'd try to co-opt the journalist. But with ISIS, you're starting to see the beginnings or the continuation of this idea that like actually we don't need Western media. We can just do this directly on Twitter, Facebook, social media, whatever it is. We can talk directly to the people. We don't have to put it through these like gatekeepers anymore. And so as a result, we can just like see these journalists as like easy targets and kill them. And so again, I'm not comparing or putting them in the same box at all whatsoever, even close. But Trump is the same thing. He's like, I don't need the media anymore. I can just talk to people directly, even though he plays a funny game with the media, right? It's like, I hate the media, but listen to this. I hate Jim Acosta. I hate CNN, but let me call on Jim Acosta and let's drum up some popularity, some excitement, some focus on this, And so it's a weird dance. I hate the New York Times, but here's some access that nobody else has. Let me, and the media, I mean, has not figured out a way to handle it, to deal with it, because this like shrill drumbeat of like, oh, Trump did this, Trump did this, Trump did this, Trump did this. I don't know that it, I mean, the midterms certainly show something that maybe it's starting to get through, but.
So Trump, ISIS, and maybe the intellectual dark web are similar in using the direct
communication,
direct outlet.
Yeah, and I didn't have to use ISIS. I mean, there's countless examples of people that have been able to do this. But ISIS is one of them. So I think that it's a reaction just to them feeling that there's not an outlet for their ideas. I know that Claire Lehman with Quillette felt that. Claire Lehman Quillette in Australia felt like that, and she talks about it a lot. That like basically she had these ideas. She's was an academic down there, and she just felt like her ideas. And she says she was blacklisted by all these newspapers there, and like her ideas didn't conform to the sort of intellectual liberal dogma, and that as a result there was not a space for it. Which I can say that does reflect my personal experiences, not because I've tried to and it has happened, like where you pitch an idea, you pitch a story, and like it doesn't get in. You don't know why it doesn't get in, but you can think like, all right, maybe it had something to do with the angle or the thing. So that's her. I think Brett Weinstein's was in the Pacific Northwest. Same thing. The guy at Google, who doesn't have a podcast, but he's also and the guy, the Weinstein got fired from the university up there for, again, like putting something out there that was like not part of the dogma. Jordan Peterson talks about this a lot, about compelled speech in Canada. Ben Shapiro has his thing, Dave Rubin. And so I think it was just like, look, we're these people, we have these ideas, and there doesn't seem to be a space for it because we're not alt-right, we're not liberal dogma, intellectual liberal dogma, if you can sort of, whatever you want to call it. I'm sure there's a name for what that is, but I'll just call it that for now and leave it there. And so, yeah, I think that, and what you're seeing, just because of the response to them and the reactions to them, that there is a huge audience. There are a lot of people who, if they don't feel this way, are extremely interested in hearing these ideas being discussed and put out there. And I think that it's a very strong sort of like nerve to touch on, that like, we're not accepted by mainstream. We're not accepted by like these gatekeepers, these, elitists and this and that, and we're being persecuted and we're being, this and that, but we're pushing back and we're going to get our ideas out there. And with Jordan Peterson, I think that you're seeing that, and Ben Shapiro, with every time he goes to talk somewhere, and like the shrill reactions to him going to talking, having safe spaces and this in response to him, it does show that they're not making this up. They're not like inventing fake controversies, that there is a great amount of resistance to them from whatever you want to call it, liberal dogma, establishment, whatever it is. So
yeah. The moral fashion policing is what I call it.
Yeah, the suede denim secret police. It happened.
Yeah. So I mean, is the intellectual dark web? I'm more familiar with like the video podcast outlets for that, but I mean that's a longer form, kind of like we're doing here. Would you consider that to be a form? I guess not of journalism, because it's not quasi-journalism, right? Because it's not reporting just facts. It's certainly its own slant, but talking about current events and everything. Like, what's your take on it?
I don't think I'd call them journalists. I don't think they call themselves journalists. I'm pretty sure they don't call themselves journalists. So
they're just kind of their own thing?
Yeah, I mean, you have them on that side. You have like on the left, like Pod Save America, with the Obama staffer alums. So I think they're more like analysts. I mean, first of all, Jordan Peterson is an academic. He's a doc. He's a
right.
In your field, I think, and Dave Rubin. You call him like a Joe Rogan is a comedian / podcast host. You call him like a host, I guess, like a radio host, but on a podcast. Dave Rubin, same. Ben Shapiro, same. Ben Shapiro. I don't know that I see them as that. I don't know if they see themselves as that. But again, you talk about journalists and who's a journalist and who's not, and these distinctions have been blurred to such an extent that I think they're still meaningful, but I don't know. No, they are still meaningful. I'll revise that. They are, because again, when you go back to like the ethical standards and the importance of adhering to those within traditional journalism versus like a Ben Shapiro or someone else that is not inherently tied to those same standards. Although again, it's hard to paint them all with the same brush, because Brett Weinstein, also academic. I hope it's Brett Weinstein. I think that's his name. He's got a brother, and one of them I think is involved with the VC, but he was an academic. Jordan Peterson, same thing. So those come with their own inherent ethical standards. So.
So I mean, it seems like a lot of this direct to the public connections that the intellectual dark web, that Trump are using, still are relying somewhat on the middleman of like Google, Facebook, Twitter, all that. And they've got like their identity checkmark system. So you had mentioned kind of during all the controversy around like Russian placed clickbait in Facebook. I mean, they're right now positioned to decide what is and isn't fake news, more or less.
There we go. This is I like this one. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that, and like the future of the relationship between journalists and big companies like Google and Facebook?
This is a great question. So I just interviewed the CEO of one of the fastest growing social media communication platforms. And the article hasn't come out, so I don't want to, that's why I'm not mentioning the specific, but a big one. And what he said to me was basically that, like, he was funny. He's like, this is like the great challenge of our generation, right? Of like, how do you manage these social media platforms? I think he's had enough. Can I go? So, these dogs, man, they're attention getters. Get back to it. You all right? 12. So, what do you want to do? I don't know if we'll edit this out or if this will be like the key part of the video. The dog behaviors.
Yeah.
Yofi, Shemesh. Yofi. So, right, so he said this is like the fundamental challenge of our generation is like these huge social media platforms and how people interact with them and what are the standards that we want for that, right? And he said like basically free speech. Free speech. Hold on, I'll back off. All right, go. What do you want to do?
I don't know.
What do you think?
Do you see your chew toy? Do you see it?
Go. Here, let's get him off. It's a good break for him. Oh, Shemesh, go. Go off. Go. Good boy. Okay. Right, so we're talking about like social media platforms and speech on those platforms and the future of journalism on those platforms. So, right, so like I said, I interviewed the head of this really big, one of the fastest growing social media platforms, especially for younger people. And what he said is that basically this is like the biggest challenge of our generation. And he said, like, look, I have my personal views on these things, but I don't necessarily want to put them on other people. But at the same time, there's not an example for how we're supposed to manage or police this. And these ideas have not been challenged and we don't know. And that's the thing, nobody knows. These are all novel, new, unique problems to a very large extent. And, but that's, there's some interesting research, there's been some interesting reports on this kind of thing where it's like we pretend, that like previously these platforms, for legal reasons, I think, and for also perhaps ideological reasons as well, said basically like, look, we're not going to police anything. We're just going to be free speech, and anything that's on there is on there, and we don't take any responsibility. We're not a publisher, we're a platform. So anything goes. And this reflects, I think, the early days of just like the internet, of idea, like this is like a free space for ideas. But of course what happened, as we can see in recent years, is you have like fake news, you have like hate groups being able to organize, you have terrorist groups being able to organize, and at some point in the last couple of years, people, they've realized that like a legal responsibility or an ethical responsibility to try to constrain somehow what is and is not on their platforms. And when you do that and you start making those decisions, you think it's easy, like, all right, like Nazis and, Islamic fascist terrorist groups, like those are out. But what happens when it's something that's like not quite reaching that level, but almost? And what happens when there's jokes? And what happens when this? And then it's a mess. And I don't have the answer. I don't think they have the answer. But I think as a society, we need to understand that that's who we have de facto outsourced these decisions to. Even like when you report, and there's a ton of debate about this online, a ton of anger, like, groups that say like, all right, kill these people or do this or do that, and then you report it to Facebook or Twitter and they just don't do anything. And Twitter's, I think, facing more animosity for this. Or even like where supposedly like Trump violates their terms of service, but they leave him on there, and so I don't think they have the answer. I mean, based on the interview that I had with the CEO, I don't think, he said like he doesn't have the answer, and it's sort of just like, we'll see what happens and then respond to it. But we as a society need to understand that like that is who is deciding it, is like Mark Zuckerberg, Jack Dorsey.
Yeah.
Twitch would be, I don't know who's in charge. Like it used to be Justin TV, and now So, but anyway, so it's a huge thing. And then as far as journalism goes, nobody knows like how's that going to work out? How's that going to impact trust in journalism? Because again, there was an interesting study that showed like when you had the New Yorker and BuzzFeed, And two stories from those outlets, that when somebody looks at the New Yorker story on the New Yorker website versus BuzzFeed on the BuzzFeed website, their levels of trust are highly skewed. But then when they see those two stories on Apple News, even with some, I think it was still with the logo of BuzzFeed, but it's both, they're accessing it on Apple News, those levels of trust, like it levels out completely. So these are like fascinating things to consider because they're business decisions, right? But then they're also content decisions and trust decisions. And what happens when you have the New York Times article next to Think Progress or Breitbart or, you know, HuffPost, you know, things that are, then what? Or, you know, in the other example, like Wall Street Journal with Breitbart and The Blaze or whatever it is. And then it's like they're all in the same place.
Yeah.
And then I think it becomes harder to distinguish among them.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm curious how do big companies like Washington Post get to have their credibility in the first place? Is it just purely experience and circulation and being in the business for a long time? And if we start to have these, you know, Twitter real checkmark systems on news where people get their news, let's say Facebook, I know Facebook got rid of their news feed recently, but let's say Facebook, can newer companies like Politico, you were saying, come around and start, or does it reduce the barriers of entry to journalism too much?
That's a good question. I think Politico is a good example of one that has been able to do that. Again, in the Hollywood context, Deadline, Hollywood.
But did Politico come around before or after there was sort of some of these verification systems in place?
I think, like on Twitter, you mean like the check
just
marks?
Like, how old is Politico now?
That's a good question. I don't know.
Okay. I'm wondering if Politico was around before people really started to get concerned about fake news.
Yes.
So I'm wondering now that people are concerned about fake news and we're combining with that companies like Facebook needing to respond to the challenges that fake news has brought, if the barriers to entry into journalism and reporting are going to become much higher and therefore just difficult to start a news company.
I'm not sure. There's an example. There's a company called Cheddar. And
Cheddar?
Yeah, so Cheddar
like
is
cheese?
Yeah.
Okay.
They call it Cheddar. It's a guy, I think he was at BuzzFeed or something. And so he started Cheddar. It started off as like a financial reporting, I think it was like exclusively on OTT, like over the top, like an app on Apple TV. I think it was on Roku, I think, and then it went to all the others, sort of like Apple TV and online and this and that. And they've been able to sort of do that, and showing like consistent growth. And it's straight news reporting. And you know, is Cheddar at the level of the Washington Post? No, but are they seen? I mean, are people going to it? Are people watching it? And it's also like sort of like more. There are a lot of interviews, a lot of like rewriting stories from other outlets, things like that. So it's not, they're not playing the same ball game as the Washington Post. And so I think there's definitely space for those new outlets to emerge. I mean, to become at the level of the Washington Post or the New York Times. Who knows? I mean, those are talking about like 150, 200-year-old news organizations that, again, benefit from that trust and from that, from funding. I mean, an interesting example, I think, is Vice. If we're talking about, like, new outlets being able to, like, come on the scene and be trusted and respected. And Vice is an interesting one because Vice's reporting is highly slanted to the left, but nevertheless, they've still been able to run themselves up to, I think, like a $4 or $5 billion valuation and have a daily show on HBO and a weekly show on HBO and like be in front of all these different, be on these different outlets in front of all these people and on these like, again, like HBO and partnerships with The Guardian and like and doing collabs with these other sort of like mainstream organizations. So it's an interesting pathway to reach that level of like respectability from a magazine that was like punk rock, drugs, sex, rock and roll, like really out there, and then to sort of like bring it in. And it's interesting also how quickly they've been able to do it when they started reporting news, because in Page One, which is a documentary about the New York Times, David Carr, who's a great reporter there and columnist for media, interviewed Shane Smith and one of the, I think, Sharush Alvi about that, and like they they really went at it, and the Vice people were like, we did this crazy stuff in Liberia, and you guys aren't doing this and that. And David Carr was like, hold the fuck on. Like, we've been doing this and sending people into harm's way for like all this time, and you guys just show up and this and that. And the Vice guys completely backed off. And since that time, really tried to become more serious in the reporting, got a bunch of people from NBC News, got a bunch of journalists from other outlets, and really run it up to become would people look at Vice and the New York Times in the same way? No, but do people look at Vice and be like, wow, this is really cool reporting, this is really interesting, like I trust it? Yeah, I think they do. So I don't know that people want to become the New York Times anymore. It's like sort of the old man on the block. I think they'd want to become more like Vice, more like a video first, more like cool, younger, on the spot, organization like that, which, although they've had their challenges, but I think probably that's something closer to the model than the other.
And in general, is video becoming more popular than print?
It's becoming more popular than print. I don't know the metrics on that, the numbers. I know that there was a study from that Oxford-Reuters partnership that said that actually Western, or in the United States at least, they want to see less news video, which was interesting because you have all these news organizations talking about we need to shift more to video, we need to focus on video, but that the readers and the consumers of their products actually want less video because it's more top down. Like, all right, you have to watch this for 3 minutes. You can't like scrub to, videos don't really work like that. Skim, versus like a news, it's like, all right, you sort of pick what you want and engage with it and then leave. So I think that there's great opportunities for video for specific things.
Have you noticed, well, of course you have. I just recently noticed on some of these, I think was it Wired or Forbes, they're starting to do like these 3-minute clips that are like complementary to some longer article that goes more into depth. I'd never seen that before. So that's just like a new video thing, right? Or how long has that been around? Maybe I've just missed out.
It's been around for a while, but I think it's certainly ramping up to a very large extent. And I think that the new ideas about how to have those two things interact has also improved, or at least evolved from the beginnings of it. And so I think that that's probably closer to what the model is for most organizations. Is like you're saying, like the complementary. Like, here I've read this thing, and like here's some news footage that like is going to go into like a different angle or deeper, or sort of like support it versus like replace it. Because you think about even just like how you access news, like on your phone or something, like, you just when you can, you kind of take a look and this looks interesting, whatever, and then versus like, all right, now I have to sit and watch this for 3 minutes, and I might not care about this in this level of depth, but if you can sort of choose, then it's maybe more valuable.
I want to ask a little bit too, you're planning on going heavier into videography and cinematography as well?
Yep.
Okay, so, and you've done some documentaries up to date, correct?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of like news video, which I don't know, they're not documentaries, they're like news video features. And then there's a feature-length documentary that I shot when I was in Israel that has been in post-production for a while. But yeah, I mean, I personally believe that, that the strength of video is not necessarily in these 2 to 3 minute clips, but in longer form things. And when you're talking about complex issues like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, like you talk about like surfer gangs, like the one story that you brought up, where that it can be more instructive in a sense than like saying, all right, this side is killing that side, or this side wants this, or this side wants that. Because I don't know how much, when you're really trying to understand an issue, really trying to like share a story, that I think people connect and relate much more to like the human elements of it. And you can do this in writing, certainly, and they do it all the time. Great work being done all the time for these sort of things. But I think a more visceral experience and a more powerful experience is when you can actually jump into this and see it in these longer form video outlets, which of course is like where VR is going and how VR is trying to like close these gaps, where like you drop in a VR environment into like a refugee camp in Greece or into Africa, and like then that becomes a way more sort of like connecting experience than just reading a 5,000 word feature on it, which again, there's a time and place and advantages to both. But for me, I think that especially when you look at like the history of just the history of America, I don't know how else to say it, but like the video representations of things, movies, documentaries, more so like movies, like that in some weird way becomes like how people see these things. Like World War II is not the reports from the New York Times, it's Saving Private Ryan. Vietnam is not, again, like, I mean, Vietnam is interesting in like in the wake of Vietnam because the Pentagon Papers and things like that certainly play a huge role in people's understanding of those conflicts. But like Apocalypse Now, Full Metal Jacket, like, and I think that it's just in a weird way, like those Zero Dark 30 for the Bin Laden raid, like in some way, like that becomes sort of the official history for most people.
And so as you shift into making movies, is your hope to do some of those works? Or are you wanting to steer into full-on fiction?
I think both. I mean, the things that are sort of like most immediately in front of me are more of like the unscripted docuseries, like 8 episodes of like a documentary, sort of stories. But for me, it's less about even like, forget like the medium. It's just the story. It's like, what is the story going to dictate here? Like, what? How does this story need to be told? Like, what is the right way to frame this or to tell it? And is there if we're talking about like a story that's actually out there and it's unscripted and you just go out and shoot it and make it and do it, like amazing, you know. But in some cases, it's not the best way to go about it, or it's not possible to tell the story that you want to tell in that sort of a format or context because of just inherent limitations or access or timing or whatever it is, and then it becomes a scripted proposition. But I would say all the above.
So one of the news videos that you created was on the surfing turf wars or gangs. Tell me about that.
Right. So this is a good example of what we were talking about before in terms of like when you get a tip and how do we verify it and how do we do it. And so I was saying that it's like a little bit different because in some cases like the official capacity and it's like offices and you have to investigate and find sourcing and documents and this and that. But in other cases you'll get a tip and you can just go to the place and like see how it manifests itself. So as a surfer, I'd always heard about this one surf spot that was like really what they call localized. So it means like the people who are from that area basically don't let other people surf there. And a lot of places have some version of this, especially in busier, more crowded surf spots around the world. But there was one that I'd always heard about in like just south of Los Angeles that was like supposed to be the worst. And it's in a really wealthy area called Palos Verdes. And so it was always weird, like, okay, it's a really wealthy area and then it's supposed to be like the worst of the surfing gangs. And there's like a history of like assaulting journalists and like other felonious assaults and like just violence and terrible.
Like to what extent?
Really like beating the hell out of people.
Really?
Yeah, like beating the hell out of people, slashing their tires, working their cars, throwing their stuff in the water. I mean, it's weird. It's like I started like beating people up to like throwing stuff in the water, but like serious stuff. And like one of the people who was eventually charged in one of these things like had been associated with another really serious assault and battery of someone at a baseball game, I think it was. And so these guys take this stuff pretty seriously. And it's like this joking thing about laid back, cool surfer hippies, this and that. It's not really like that. I mean, it can be like that in places, again, where it's like less crowded. It's like supply and demand and battle over resources. But like people, they feel like this association and they start to like identify with the surfing spot. Like, so anyways, that's sort of the background and the context. I'd heard tips like, this is the worst one, this is the worst one, da-da-da. I got a colleague, this was for The Guardian, so we went down there, he's Irish, he doesn't surf, and we just sort of like, I brought my surfboard, and the idea was like to just check it out, like to see and like go down there and say like, all right, is it really as bad as everybody says? And usually what happens in situations like that is you go and you paddle out, and then people will react to you based on how you behave in the water. So if you're what they call respectful, like if you wait your turn, basically, for the waves, then it'll be okay. People will look at you like, kind of like weird, like askance, but it won't go much beyond that. And I've faced that before in Hawaii, Australia, California, lots of places. Like, but here, like we walk down this cliff, and you have to understand like the way it is. Like it's a cliff and a little bay, Lunata Bay, and then there's basically one way in, one way out. It's a goat trail. It's really thin, this and that, and there's like only a few places to park. It's like a really nice residential area, and there's like these guys, middle-aged guys, and they have like radios, and they're like talking to each other, and like or cell phones, and like, oh, he parked here, he parked there, watch him. We walked down there, and right when we walked down there, this guy was like, you guys lost or something? Like, you're in the wrong place. Like, you guys aren't from here, this and that. And basically, we saw just as two people, like, what happens to people who try to go down there. And then it got even better because people were threatening and this and that, but like... So
just to make sure I'm understanding, why do they care about their turf? Because there's just not enough waves to ride as they're surfing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's like X amount of waves for Y amount of people. And what they would say is like, we're defending the place from outsiders who want to come in and make it dirty and defile it and pollute and this and that, like what you have in Malibu. So Malibu in Surfrider Beach, you have a situation where it's really easy to access the wave, and people can see the wave from the highway. You can see it from this road too, the wave here, but it's the ease of access and sort of like, and so it's crowded as heck. You know, I mean, it's really crowded, and it is kind of like dirty, and so you can see. And that's like what they'll say, but that's like the cop-out answer because it's a public resource that everyone's supposed to be able to use. And like if you don't want people to use it to such an extent, there are legal ways to go about doing that. Make it 1 hour parking, make it, you know, do whatever you want to do. But it's not, and it ties in because what ended up happening is my car ended up getting vandalized, and we went to the police station, and the police were like, yeah, we know who they all are, but if you don't like it, we're not going to do it. Like, if you don't like it, don't go down there. So the community is working with the police to keep people out. They don't want people in their community. And that was like, and the LA Times followed up. Every major newspaper followed up on the story. We shot this video. It became international news. The Coastal Commission got involved. The two people I think filed federal lawsuits that, I don't know the status of them at this point. They had a little clubhouse down there, like a fort or whatever, built out of rocks and wood and this and that, like where they hung out. And the Coastal Commission got rid of that, because it was in violation of building permits and so on and so forth. But I don't know what the latest is. I don't know if people have, like, if they've opened it up or not. I doubt it because the attention is kind of focused elsewhere. But it was just an example of a story. It was like you hear all these rumors, you see all this stuff. Everyone, they know they've acted with impunity for like 30, 40 years or whatever it is or more. And we just kind of went down there to like see for ourselves kind of thing. And so...
So what happened once you got there and they're asking you if you're lost?
No, they weren't asking. Like, to be clear, they were like threatening. They were like,
okay,
you guys lost? Like, you sure you want to be here? You shouldn't be here. If you, don't come. And the guys were like, don't. And it's in the video. People can see. It's like, don't fucking come down here, man. And there's way worse stuff that we didn't end up including in the final edit, which is a good example of how editors can be involved in the process because we had made this longer video and then my editor at that time just like chopped it up and then put it out there. So, and it was effective. I mean, it honed in on like the meat of the issue, but yeah, just like, but it was interesting because they were all very, like, in a very American legalistic way. They like didn't cross the line. They were like, they're like, bad things are going to happen if you go out there. And we tried to say like, are you going to assault us if we go out there? Are you going to throw something? Like, no, I'm not. I'm not saying I'm going to do it, man, but like, someone else is going to do this and that and blah, blah, blah. And so there's like all sorts of like, and then we understood that like sometimes if they feel outgunned, so to speak, then they'll try to get somebody to assault them and then sue that person. So it's this whole like legal weird lawsuit, like we're tough guys, but within the confines of the law kind of thing. But they feel emboldened because some of the people surfing down there allegedly are like judges and lawyers and people in that community. There's a cop from another community, I think El Segundo, who was there, and he got run over with a surfboard and got sliced and cut in the whole thing. And they're like, well, it was by accident. And it's really hard to prove in those situations, oh, this was on purpose, and it's surfing, so it's not taken as seriously, because it's like, they're just surfers joking around, whatever, this and that, but they take it pretty seriously, and people have gotten hurt down there, and it's a public resource, and that's why The Guardian was interested in doing it, I think, and that's, I think, why there was such public interest of, like, guys acting like this, middle-aged guys, mostly white, rich, and hoarding this land, this area, which they called, like, this is a sacred land for us, and we learned that, like, for them it's like a gang. Like, you have to get, like, you start when you're young and you paddle out there and you get beat up and you can't, surf where you want and you have to wait your turn. It takes, like, decades to do that. And then finally, like, earn your place in the line. And so from their standpoint, again, they're like, someone's just going to come out here and I had to get beat up and I had to get treated like crap and then you're just going to come out here and paddle and catch waves and, like, no, we're not going to do that. And even to the extent that, like, even if you know somebody there, it's not even a situation like that. You can't have somebody vouch for you, because we asked people, we're like, well, what if I paddle out with you? And he's like, no, man, it's not like Facebook. You can't just add friends. Like, so
were you fearful at all for your safety when you were working on that story?
Kind of. Like, it seemed like a little bit heavy. I mean, you're down there isolated. There's no, like, person that can come and help you and this and that. My guy who I went with, my colleague, Rory, he'd actually gotten kidnapped in Iraq.
Oh, wow.
By Muqtada al-Sadr's group. And he had been, I think, for a few days. And I kind of turned to him at one point as a joke, and I was like, man, this is like, how is this compared to Iraq or something, and this and that. And he's like, well, at least in Iraq there were people with guns on our side, this and that. Like, and so it was like, in retrospect, it was not a war zone. I don't know how much physical danger we were actually in, probably not much. Although they'd like throw rocks at people and this and that. So
Wow.
it didn't feel good. I can tell you that. And it's just this weird, like spooky, almost Tim Burton-esque, like suburb gone to hell sort of feeling there of like
So bizarre.
Stepford Wives, like bad vibes. And then it's a stunning area. It's a stunning area. And then it's like you have that, but then you have this other side to it. And then there was this internal debate in that community talking about, do we want our community to be associated with this like gang behavior? It's hurting our property values. And then the other side was like, well, do we really want outsiders coming in and like thinking that they can just do whatever they want here? Doing whatever they want, being like in public land.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
yeah.
it's, yeah, I mean, it's a debate in California, I guess, that has pretty much been decided everywhere except for this place called Hollister Ranch, which is sort of like the last bastion of like a protected private piece of coast that people just can't access freely. There's a billionaire here south of where we're sitting now, forgot his name, where he tried to cut off access because he had this huge plot of land. He's like, no, this is private. We're not going to have a way to access it. And I'm pretty sure the California Supreme Court said basically that you have to. Or it's going back and forth. I think the last thing was like that you have to. So,
Wow, that's wild. You wouldn't think of surfers as being violent, and also just you wouldn't think of going to the beach as like a scary thing, like compared to your time in Israel. I mean, that
or someone's time in Iraq.
Yeah,
getting kidnapped in Iraq. So, I mean, but I think that it's a really good point because I mean, kind of going back to where we started about Israel and about that conflict and the role of news in sort of like portraying these different areas. Like, this area, Palos Verdes, is like portrayed before me and Rory is this like idyllic, safe community and everything's good. No, it's all cool. Same thing with Thousand Oaks, by the way. And the reality is like Israel's a war zone, right? And Israel's terrible and this and that. But the reality is so much more complex and nuanced. And going back to like the video and the ability to sort of engage with those things. And I think it sometimes takes that because there's been such an onslaught of like one narrative in Israel and the Palestinian territories of something. And then you go there and it's something so completely and radically different than what you expect. I mean, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to do these shows about things that take place there, because so often people see it as like this is a religious conflict, and on one side are Jews, Israelis, and on the other, even though something like a fifth of Israelis are actually Muslim and Arab, and the other side are Palestinians. And these are the fault lines, and you're either on one side or the other. But the reality is that there's a tremendous amount of conflict within Palestinian society between the different factions, and the amount of factionalization is incredibly complex. And I mean, you can see in Syria, for instance, that even there, like Sunni and Shia are killing the hell out of each other. And so within Palestinian society, the fault line is not Sunni and Shia. It's, Hamas and Palestinian Authority, PLO, and Islamic Jihad, and elements of Al-Qaeda and ISIS and this and that. But, you have countless examples of how this plays out, and something that's, like in Gaza, like Hamas was like throwing Palestinian Authority people like off of buildings when they were there. And they're constantly duking it out to like maintain supremacy there and like to maintain their sense of control. And a lot of times, again, like the Israelis are sort of this like boogeyman, but for them, they're within their society, like they're far more concerned about like this guy over there who I hate, who now I'm going to use that hatred to sort of like benefit myself by saying like, you're not getting the water that you deserve, your city should get, and it's because of some third cause,
Yeah, so. You had mentioned earlier that it's less about, it seems like it's now less about religion and more about self-interest. So what do you mean? Like people are just leveraging the confusion to get a valued resource like the water you were just talking about, or?
Not necessarily the water, money.
Okay.
Like the amount of aid that the Palestinian Authority, and to back up, the Palestinian Authority was the government that was created in the wake of Oslo, the Oslo agreements, which was, in the 90s, early 90s, 93, I think, that created sort of a semi-formal agreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis, with Yasser Arafat being the leader of the Palestinians, and his group called PLO became the de facto Palestinian Authority. And they became the government of these Palestinian cities, basically. And there was this recognition sort of on both sides. And, but instead of that evolving and developing into a more formalized agreement and there being peace, it devolved. And you have what you have now, which is just separation basically between the two peoples. And, you know, a lot of times this is misconstrued as, you know, it's like, this is apartheid. This is some sort of like a regime that's separation on ethnic or racial lines or something, which is weird because something like half of Israelis come from Arab countries. My girlfriend's Yemen, you know, from Yemen. So it's strange that this has become a racial thing. But, and again, a fifth of Israelis are Arab. One of them serves on the Supreme Court of Israel. They're able to do exactly the same things as Israelis if they choose. They can even serve in the army. I'm talking about Arab Israelis. A lot of them choose not to, and they're not forced to. But then going back to what happened on the other side, so you had all of this like system that had been set up, and then it devolved, and then what it turned into is this sort of like extremely corrupt situation where it's like when you go to Ramallah, the place where now Mahmoud Abbas, who's the leader, lives, and it's a brilliant palace, and it's huge, and like in the shadow of that are these refugee camps. But then next to those, it's like Microsoft, KFC, this bank, that bank. Like the center of Ramallah looks like a European city. Ramallah, which is a Palestinian city, is nicer than many Israeli cities in much of it. Again, you have your refugee camps, you have other parts that aren't quite as nice, but it's complex of why it stays like that. Because, for instance, if things would evolve, if there would be a more formalized peace agreement, maybe that aid wouldn't flow in quite the same way. Maybe you know, those people who are in power wouldn't have quite so much power anymore. Mahmoud Abbas, the PLO guy now, the PA guy, is deeply unpopular amongst his own people, and so the dance to stay in power is such that, you know, he sort of has to play both sides, and the fault lines that are then created as a result of the tenuousness of his hold on power, I think explained far more about what we're seeing today than this typical Jews versus Muslims, and having that be the explanation.
Do Israelis and Palestinians understand that? Like, do they view it that way?
Many of them do, but it's like everywhere else, where it's like, you know, becomes a visceral sort of like thing, and fear is then mixed into it, and just feelings, and like, it's hard to I mean, the way I'll say it is like, I think that on some level they do, but on the other level they're like, I don't know that we being Israelis or Palestinians can afford to engage with it on that level, because they're throwing rockets at us, and they're bombing us with their airplanes, and they're setting up checkpoints, and then, well, we're setting up checkpoints so you don't come into our cities and kill us in cafes and pizza places anymore, and so there's just like cycle of distrust that feeds and flows into one side to the other, you know, and like, and then again, but again, I don't want to have like an equivalence, because on the one hand, you have on the one side, like when a Palestinian goes to a cafe and blows himself up, they name a street after him and becomes like a hero, and he gets, or if they try to do it and they go to jail, they get paid every month by the government, by the Palestinian government, versus the Israelis, when you have, for instance, a Jewish terrorist who went in and did something, he's absolutely not, he's a pariah. He's put completely on this, and it's a dishonor in a sense. So the way that these things are being portrayed are different. The Palestinians would say that like this is their recourse to trying to create something. The Israelis would say, no, it's not. We offered you all of this land, and you didn't want it, and you didn't want to take it, because ultimately, and I think this explains it the best, the Palestinian guide who I had when I went into those areas one of the times, I looked at him and I said, look, like clearly you see these Israelis are here. You're not going to, they're, you know, like this is the situation. You're not going to, a suicide bombing is not going to force them to leave. And he said, yeah, but how long did your people wait for a country? And I said, I'm near about 2,000 years. He said, okay, we've only had to wait 60 something. So that's the timeline that people are operating on over there. And the two sides, like many of the Palestinians truly do not believe that the Israelis have any place, that the Jews have any place there, or certainly not as a ruling people with sovereignty like almost every other people. So, and then the Israelis say like, all right, you know, they do or they don't, but like they're trying to kill us and they hate us and they're, you know, they won't even talk to us basically, and it becomes a capital crime. So this is like the starting point, and it's like, it seems a lot of times like it's mutually irreconcilable, you know?
So what would be your ideal, are you ever planning on doing a video or a video series or some sort of a format to document that complexity? And if so, like what's the right format?
Excuse me. So the answer is yes. There's one show in development, and I think that it's by trying to do it by a third party. So showing what would it be like for an American to drop themselves into the middle of this situation and to then expose these different fault lines and to show the differences of what versus the expectation versus what actually happens. And I think that maybe it's something like that, but the question I think becomes, who's it for? Like, is it for people outside of there to understand the situation, or is it for people there to understand the situation better amongst themselves? And I think there's maybe a way to do both. But as an American, my goal is to do it for an American audience, because I'm an American. And
how would you do it? Are you planning like one of those vantage point kind of?
To be shared at a later date, because it's in development. But I think we have a pretty unique way of doing it that really cuts to the meat of the issue, the heart of the issue, and does it in a way that hasn't been shown before, hasn't been seen before, and I think shows a lot of the things that I've been talking about, just about that. Someone could go there and think that they're going to be, that the enemy, so to speak, right, is the Palestinians writ large. But then they find that, oh, wait, I met this really cool guy at the shop in Jerusalem and he seems cool. But then my landlord is a jerk and he's Israeli and Jewish. And so maybe my actual, like, the person on a daily basis that I'm interacting with, maybe that's more relevant to me than these, like, greater, larger scheme of things, which is a fascinating thing to consider, especially when you talk about journalism and stuff. Like, yeah, we create these narratives, we try to show the big picture story a lot of times and to understand, and it explains it on one level, but when you're talking about what it's like for the everyday person, and your average everyday Israeli is not worried about getting blown up in a cafe or getting shot or stabbed or something like that. They're worried about, like, their rent, they're worried about traffic, they're worried about their test coming up in school, until of course they have to go to the army for 3 years, then they're worried about that. And from the Palestinian side, day-to-day life, when there's not a war, when there's not conflict, when there's not a crackdown, so to speak, on increasing security by the Israelis, it's the same everyday job, economy, life, work. And I don't want to go so far as then to extend it, like I said before, like everybody wants the same thing. I don't think that everybody does want the same thing, but there are certainly common points, like a Venn diagram, so to speak. So I think it's safe to say that everybody wants to have a job or income or just the comfortable living situation. So I'm pretty sure that.
So you're trying to capture and portray that through your series.
Ideally, but really the series, it's going to be a part of it. But then also, obviously, it's just like it comes always back to character. It comes back to people. It comes back to their experiences. So I want it to be like that's sort of the setting. That's what's being reflected, and that's sort of like what you get along with it. But really, these are in an ultimate, or hopefully, be stories about. There's probably 4 or 5 main characters, their journey, their experience as they go through and show and see that what they expected and what most people expect out of that region, out of that area, is not what they get. And I think that's you want to talk about like a big rule or a big thing that's consistent across everything. Over there, I think that's what it is, that like nothing is quite what it appears to be, or as simple as it appears to be, or even... Yeah, like there's not a whole lot of getting what you expect to get, for better and worse. And again, like you might expect a war zone, but you get people partying until 5 a.m. So. And
does the series have a name yet?
Yes, it's called Enlisted.
Enlisted.
Which kind of gives away a little bit about what it is, but
hopefully not too much.
Yeah, but not. It's not what it seems to a large degree, just even based on the name. But it's a hint. So.
And when is Enlisted? What's the timeline for it? When is it going to come out?
Hopefully soon.
Really?
Hopefully soon. But again, like even Enlisted reflects the realities of life over there, because what I expected with it in terms of the timeline is not what I got.
Okay, but so soon is vague.
Soon is vague.
Is soon like a matter of months or a matter of like the next couple of years, or?
Hopefully it'll be like in the next year. We are still looking for another partner. So if someone's watching this and they're interested in this sort of milieu and they want to support interesting journalist-based work in this field, we are open to an extent to engaging with those partners. We do have a big partner, a big piece of this whole thing locked in, and so we're just sort of waiting for the last piece, and then we'll be ready to go. We're just waiting to close some of the business side part of it.
So. Cool. Noah, that's awesome. Thank you. Thank you for the conversation. Thank you so much for telling me all about the ins and outs of journalism and putting up with some of my naive questions on everything from journalism to Israel. I've really enjoyed my time with you.
Thank you, and thank you for having me on, and thank you for like I said, was touching on before, just like from the academic standpoint that you're coming from, it opens up new questions and new ideas, and for me to even look at things that I hadn't considered before. So thank you.
Awesome.